World War II history, and in fact, history in general, is always a place that I thought I knew quite a bit. It's not until recently on this channel that I learned it's one of my weaker points, and thanks to some of your suggestions, I've been able to learn a lot in a relatively short time, and I think that's going to be the case today when we look at the fallen of World War II. Welcome back, friends, and a special welcome to all the new friends out there. I'm YoBGS, admittedly a bit of a history noob, but I'm trying to fix that thanks to your help. And today we're going to be looking at something, the fall of World War II, and you've told me that it is going to help visualize exactly what the cost was when it came to World War II. Now, I don't know if this is going to be more of an infographic type thing. That's definitely what it looks like. And when I see these, I'm always reminded of a quote by Penn from Penn and Teller. He said, if a number is so big that we can't eat that number in M&Ms, it's too big for our brains to comprehend. And I'm fully expecting that's gonna be the case today, and some of these numbers are just gonna break my brain. If you want, leave a comment down below. Let me know if there's anything else, doesn't necessarily have to be history related, that you want me to check out. And again, if you dig this journey I'm going on and you wanna be a part of it, please make sure to click that subscribe button. It helps out a ton. Here we go. Normally I'm excited at this part, but today I'm nervous, and with good reason, I think. Right?
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years. And an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still.
I'm already stopping to look at some of these names, and I'm making a mental note of like, okay, these are people I need to Google, because admittedly, now I know who Harry Truman was, but some of these people I don't know and I don't recognize. And also, I think this is interesting because there were definitely people that served under the age of 18. Now I know that they're talking in an official capacity, but still.
And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost.
And there's a lot of YouTube channels that have done a great job of that.
This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people.
Yeah, I was about to say, it slowly hit me as the visualization happened. I'm like, oh, none of those are making it none of those are making it past a certain point.
And it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives are cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts.
Well, and what's so wild now is, I don't know, it feels like because the news, is around 24/7 and we always have the ability to stay in touch with different things, there's this weird thing that happens, and I say this as somebody who worked in journalism for, 5 years, 6 years at this point. You just, you get desensitized to it. I don't know. And then again, you see it all like this, and you're like, it stops you.
We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died.
The animation's really cool.
Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23. In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who were injured.
Really? Well, I mean, yeah, I guess that makes sense, especially when you take into account, the atomic bombs and things like that injured, hundreds of thousands, millions potentially. Arguably, the impact of some of that is impossible to tell. Do you count somebody who wasn't working, who do you count somebody who had a normal civilian job and then worked in a factory and got hurt in the factory? Do you count them as being hurt in the war effort either?
Casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths, and we'll begin with American soldiers.
I'm already uncomfortable what, 440,000?
Over 400,000 died.
Okay. The only reason I know that, by the way, it's sad. The only reason I was on with that is because when the pandemic first started and, you know, people were losing their lives as a result of that, I remembered keeping an eye on it and comparing it to the amount of people that died in World War II. And that was just like, those were two numbers my brain was constantly comparing, and then this blew past. I'm not here to make a point about this or that. It's just, that's where I got that from.
Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the U.S. wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, he's talking about just the U.S. I got confused for a second because I was like, there were definitely deaths in 40.
2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell.
Which, putting in context, God, these pictures... And I almost feel like a lot of these photos do a disservice to people because this guy is the only one whose face we can actually see. Looks terrified, right? Now you imagine all of these people, and they're wearing, what, 40, 50 pounds of gear, something like that? How terrified everybody in this situation must have been. And then you compare that to something, what, like 9/11, where I think over 3,000 people, you know, passed away as well, and it's just
the number of U.S. soldiers
ridiculous.
Died on this single beach landing, as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan.
You can't even see, you can barely make out the hills.
The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks.
And I know I'm pausing a lot this time, but it's just every time I hear or see something like this, it sticks out in my brain. You know, the 82 days of fighting. We thought the SATs were long, you know, and those are like 4 hours, right? You think about somebody who's been through a surgery, and granted, those can be life-changing. Yeah, I had a pretty big one last year. That was an hour, you know, and then the recovery was 2 weeks, 14 days. This was 82 days where you're literally like, if I pass out somewhere, I may not wake back up.
Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks. Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe. Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union.
One event, and again, you can leave a comment yelling at me if I pause too much, but just looking at everything, may have needed a shot and a beer before this one.
Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides, but the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions.
Which also brings up an amazing point. You know, we think in the U.S., and this has been a point in a lot of my history videos, in the U.S., we think that we, you know, had the worst of everything. We did the most fighting, you know, we were front and center, the all of it. And then it's like you hear Yugoslavia, a country that, I'm going to go out on a limb, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't even have the population of the U.S., lost more soldiers than the U.S. did, arguably in a shorter period of time. Well, I guess it was a longer period of time, but just ridiculous.
The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium.
And I just shake my head, and I know, look, we're 4 minutes in, I'm already worried, but I shake my head because it's so, it all just feels so senseless, you know? And again, I'm not breaking any new ground
But most
here.
Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front, Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering. The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad.
500,000 in one area, one battle, I want to say one encounter, but obviously it was many encounters over a long period of time.
Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US.
See, and like, look at this. Here's the US, and then just chunk after chunk after chunk. And this went off screen entirely. Because what's the saying that World War II was won with? I'm gonna botch it, but it was like Soviet manpower. Was it British intelligence and American engineering or something? American tanks, something like that.
And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany.
Dude, and that's a victory. Get out of here.
The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers. But winning the war...
And this is an entire... Look at this! We've been scrolling for like a minute now, and it's not even... You always, like, you see these videos, you know, and it's like, oh, this is how big the Earth is compared to Jupiter or something like that. But again, when you take into account each of these figures is 1,000 people, and then you take into account the families they probably had, the associations, what they would have contributed to society had it not been, you know, had they not just been one part of one 1/1000th of one stick figure on one graph. No one wants me to soap. Jesus Christ. I'm literally like looking at other crap in my room right now. Like I'm looking at the closet, you know, I'm looking down, like trying to pretend this number isn't real as if that's somehow gonna fix it. And again, this is in a much smaller world at the time.
8.7 million is the official tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number. Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead.
Twice as many as that. Like, I think there's an old Eddie Izzard bit that I remember where he mentioned something along the lines of like 20 million Germans were either killed or not Germans, 20 million Russians were killed or injured. And it's a number because again, it's a number you can't eat in M&Ms. It goes in one brain, out the other, and you're just like, okay, whatever, 20 million. But then a visualization of it, like, literally just it takes your insides, it turns them upside down.
To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis. Hungary, Romania, and Italy.
I was about to say, what? Okay.
When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you'd like more time.
You know, it will probably help me, but it's not for today, my dude.
And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe.
What if I don't want to?
6 million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust. If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries.
I would not have guessed that Italy would have been, again, so small on that tally. I would have guessed that France. And see, but this is the thing about the visualization, right? You're like, oh, this is so small. And then your brain, because your brain, like, again, our stupid hunter-gatherer brains, we just want to compare and be like, oh, this isn't that bad. But then you're like, wait a minute. No, it's awful because each one of these is 1,000. So 5,000 multiplied across there. That's a catastrophe. That's terrible. That's...
Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps.
Why would I want to? Why
Over 1 million
do I need
died
to
in
know
Auschwitz.
this? Like, I know why I need to know it, but again, I'm just gonna sit here and soapbox about why can't people be good people. It's, again, nothing no one's heard before. I'm not breaking any new ground here. I'm not gonna solve problems by pointing that. I don't know. I'm halfway through. Maybe this just makes me be a better person.
Killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station. Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews.
And the way everything zooms in, Jesus Christ.
Like with the gas
Hang
chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
Can I see anything else? Made it worse. I don't know. Like, I'm talking a lot, I feel, because seeing all of that is so incredibly uncomfortable. I don't... If you're watching through this, if you recommended this, I think you knew this is kind of what was going to happen, but... And then you take into account, again, and he mentioned we might do this toward the end of this video, but comparing it to everything that's going on now, and you just... What do you do?
The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed.
And I would guess
about 250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation, some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years.
Years? Excuse you? Years? Like, you can't... Like, it's grossly inappropriate to make jokes, you know? And try and be funny, but I'm being dead serious when I'm like, if my life were interrupted or inconvenienced for any length of time, let alone 2.5 years, right? And we all think about that. I think we think about, like, again, with the pandemic and stuff, how much people's lives changed. Some people's didn't really change that much, but people treat that like it was some sort of colossal situation when, look at this, and this is 2.5 years. That puts so much of it in perspective.
1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians. Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded.
It's crazy that, again, something like that happens, and then now that's just a thing we reference in Call of Duty.
While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths. But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million.
And those numbers, in some instance, at least if I'm understanding it right, are people that, they're, in some instances, I don't want to say all, because generalizing in this state is awful, but some of those were people that their only fault was literally being born in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Let's step back and see where we are with the totals.
I want to know, okay, so as a percentage of population, this feels like this had to have been like most of Poland.
We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million. Then we have the Asian theater. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan. On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty.
See, and that's something else that I remember it was touched on in Oversimplified's video, but it's not something that I realized on this scale until obviously you see it here.
China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis. Which
is also more than the US lost in the entire war, and that was just one horrible military maneuver gone. I don't know, did it go awry? Did it fail? What do you call that?
But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official US statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets. When you add all the deaths outside Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war, give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included. More people died in World War II than in any other war in history.
I would imagine than in any other set of circumstances in history. What, maybe like the Black Death, but again, when the Black Death went around, there weren't as many people, at least not that we knew of.
For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry. Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years. The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest.
And then I see these, right? Look, I'm not like, oh, I should make videos discussing all of this stuff, but you see this and it makes me feel stupid. I don't know what Timur-Lenk is. I know what the Mongol conquest was, but the An-Lushan revolt, I don't know what that was. The Taiping rebellion, I think I've heard of, but again, if there was a multiple choice question that was like, match up this with what it was I'm getting like a 5. And then you just, again, like you see that and you're like embarrassed for yourself, but I don't know, I'm trying to better myself, I'm trying to watch these, so maybe that helps.
If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died.
I don't. Actually, I do.
We can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking.
And see, that's what I'm saying. The Oluchen revolt seemed to be the most deadly thing ever in ever.
When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase,
Dude, my heart sunk. When I saw the striped lines, I was waiting for like, this many billion people.
Long peace.
And I was just like, what the hell did I not know about now?
The nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq.
Yeah.
But rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire.
And again, all of that feels very, it's weird seeing it now because we're on we're in a brink of a pretty tenuous time, so it's kind of a weird thing to, it's a weird thing to hear is the close to all of this.
To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II.
Well, yeah.
And they can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all. And here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since.
But that doesn't make them not bad.
And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now, bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline. Peace,
which again, kind of changes lately.
It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs or report on it.
Because it's one of those difficult things where, it almost ends up not being peace so much as it ends up being non-war. And from a journalism standpoint, it can be very hard to be like, war didn't happen today. Because they tell you, right, all the people that are making all the money off of it, that's not going to sell. No one buys a thing that says everything normal.
Sometimes it takes reminding
ourselves and then it doesn't get covered.
Of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue.
Yeah, I'm from the future,
and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
It did. It did. But again, I'm from the future, and not as much, unfortunately. It makes you feel so small, right? Even though he zoomed into this micro level, you know, where we're watching the seconds tick by in this, you feel small.
If you'd like to support this project and encourage new episodes,
absolutely,
please follow us using one of the options below. And consider paying the suggested ticket price for today's show. Thank you very much.
I didn't know there was a suggested ticket price. I'll have to look into that and try and, you know, do my part to pay what I owe. I think that's only fair. Although it is a bit of a weird situation where you're paying the price of admission to feel terrible, which is kind of where I'm at now. Because it's just one of those situations where I learned a lot, but I feel like, I don't know, I feel like I've been through the ringer. Because you watch something like this and you consider, you know, the things that they're bringing up to discuss in the video, and it just becomes a matter of like, you feel so dumb that you didn't know that all of this was the magnitude of it. And even then, seeing something like this still makes it really hard to conceptualize, right? Because 41 million is, what, is that like the population of California now? You know, so you think about it in those terms, and any way you slice it or break it down, inherently it kind of manipulates the numbers. It either makes you think of it as bigger or smaller than it really is. But then when you see it all out here like this, I don't know. And I'm, again, leave a comment down below if there's something you want me to check out, because it's helping me out. I definitely feel like a better person for having learned it, you know? So yeah, subscribe if you like these kind of videos. Leave a comment if there's something you think I should check out. In the meantime, take care, friends, and I will see you for the next one.